Lecture 27.
Let me just share something with you that you may not have noticed in the scriptures before. A group of missionaries came back from their mission to see the prophet Joseph Smith, and they were very anxious to be helpful in the kingdom and do a lot of good. And so they were very enthusiastic. This is September 1832, you see, so the church is very young. They wanted to help build a new Jerusalem. They wanted to perform a great service in the kingdom. And were they shocked when the Lord kind of took them to task? Because they've just back off their missions. Your minds in times past have been darkened because of unbelief. How can missionaries be guilty of unbelief? And because you have treated lightly the things you have received, which vanity and unbelief have brought the whole church under condemnation. So it wasn't just these missionaries, it was the whole church. And this condemnation rests upon the children of Zion, even all. The whole church was under the Lord's indictment here, and still is. I want you to see why. And they shall remain under this condemnation until they repent and remember the new covenant, even the book of Mormon, and the former commandments which I have given them, not only to say, but to do according to that which I have written. One of our big problems in the church is that we study the Book of Mormon just long enough to, what? Find out if it's true. And we find out it is true. We have a testimony of it, and we set it aside and never go back. The whole church is guilty of that, with the exception of very few people. And you're among those we are depending upon to change that climate in the church and lift this cloud off of the kingdom. The Lord has 2/3 of the Book of Mormon plates that have never been translated. And he's waiting for a generation of members of the church to know the Book of Mormon well enough so that he is justified in revealing the other 2/3. It's the 84th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, beginning with the 54th verse up to the 60th verse. And will you just remember that the whole church is under condemnation for not studying the Book of Mormon. 84th section. This is the great priesthood section. Brother Lee pointed this out recently, and I just wanted to share that with you because our people are not good students as a people, and our Heavenly Father has treasures to unload if we'll study better. And he said, I revealed this to you. I saved this book here. It took me 2,500 years of careful preparation and the sacrifice of the lives of many people to bring this to you. And it's sitting on your shelves. So that's why I'm proud of you. Your Heavenly Father loves you for having gone the 3rd and 4th mile in this study. Because you're beginning to get the Book of Mormon where it ought to be, where you know the people, you know the doctrine, you know why the doctrine is there, you know what our Heavenly Father's done in the past for his people, even though they didn't always appreciate it. He wants you to know the Book of Mormon that well, so that when you have spare time, you say, I love this book, and you open it up and you read it, just because you love to read it. Now that's only possible when you know this book like the palm of your hand, and you run across an Amalekiah, you know who Amalekiah is, and you read it first up here, Lehantai, oh yeah, Lehantai, I remember Lehantai. All right, now, I want you to take down a list of about 22 names now as I go through them. See if you can come up with them, because these are the kind of things that I put on the exam. Sometimes they say, now, Brother Skousen, why don't you just emphasize the doctrines that are treated? The reason I emphasize history so much is because once you get the history, the doctrine fits right in. I emphasize doctrine too. But very often the history is neglected. And you'll notice if you want to know about the atonement and the resurrection, if you just remember that it was Alma's talk to Corianton, you'll have no trouble flipping to Alma 40, 41, and 42 and come up with it just like that. It'll make it easier for you to memorize it. All right? Right at the beginning of our semester study, we had a real hardcore apostate Antichrist who rose up in the land and tried to set up a new church. And his name was Korihor. Korihor. Now Alma, while he was on his mission down to Ammonihah and almost got killed, succeeded in bringing out of Ammonihah some converts. Two of them were famous, rich, wicked men, and they later became two of his best missionary companions. What were their names? Amulek and Zeezrom. Which one was the attorney? Zeezrom. Later, when Alma wanted to go and preach to the Zoramites, he took both of these men with him as missionaries. In order to have someone governing the church while he was gone, he left which son? Helaman. So you'll want to remember Helaman. But he took his other two sons with him. The second son was Shiblon. And the third son, Corianton. A little wild teenager. Corianton. Then they came back, and all their converts met with the people of Ammon, which at that time were in the land of Jershon. Now, as soon as the apostate Zoramites realized what a big chunk of their people had gone over and joined the Nephites, that is, had been converted to the church, they then went storming over to the Lamanites and induced one of the great generals of the Lamanites, who really wanted to be king and take over both the Lamanites and Nephites, to attack. And he used the Zoramites as his captains mostly, because they hated the Nephites so. Now this Lamanite general that wanted to be king and who later lost his scalp was Zarahemla. Good. Zarahemla. Zerahemnah. Okay, so after that war was over, things were improving somewhat. We had an individual rise up who wanted to become king, and he wanted to kill Helaman, the president of the church. He wanted to do away with the Constitution. He wanted to make himself king and put an aristocracy in charge of the Nephites. What was his name? Amalickiah. And that's when Moroni stood up and said, we just can't tolerate this kind of insurrection. And so he raised up his great title of liberty, called all of those who had pledged their lives to defend liberty by what name? Free men, and went out after Amalickiah. Now his title of liberty said, in memory of our God, religion, freedom, peace, lives, children. Families. Children? Okay. All right, our wives and our children. And Amalickiah escaped with his brother, whose name was Amoron. Now it's two M's, O-R-O-N, and you have to be careful because the Book of Mormon has an Amoron, Amoron, one M, and an Amaron, one M. Okay. Amoron, brother of Amalickiah. Of what tribe are these people? What lineage? They're Zoramites, okay. And Amalickiah went up and joined the Lamanite king and tried to get the king to attack. He said, all right, we will attack, but only part of the army was willing to go. The rest of the army ran away from the capital city, wouldn't rendezvous, wouldn't mobilize, probably were under oath never to fight again. And they were under the leadership of a man who took them over to Oneida Mountain, where the Lamanites usually got all their swords and bows, which where they had their armament. And this Lamanite took the people and camped up on top of the mountain. But the king said to Amalickiah, now you go and get him and make him fight, and then you can attack the Lamanites, but whip them first. So Amalickiah approached him, and his name was Lehonti, great bold Lamanite. And he ended up getting what? He was poisoned to death by Amalickiah. Okay, now you know Lehonti. So Amalickiah, after having the king murdered and wooing the wife of the king of the Lamanites, got ready to launch his attack on the Nephites. Moroni was expecting him, spent 4 years preparing the people, armed all of their cities, and was ready to go. But just about the time he was ready to go, the leader of one of his main defense cities rose up in insurrection. What was his name? Morianton. And he did something he shouldn't have done, and he expected Moroni to take action against him. So he ran toward the land northward and was intercepted at Bountiful by Captain Teancum. And what did he do to Morianton? In the fight that ensued, he killed him. People were all taken back and were just getting settled down when Nephiah died. Nephiah died. Now, who's Nephiah? The chief judge, the number 2 chief judge, a very righteous man who replaced Alma. Nephiah died, and his son then became the chief judge, and what was his name? Pahoran. P-A-H-O-R-A-N. Pahoran. And immediately there was a big to-do about let's not have a chief judge, let's have a king. What group of people wanted to set up a monarchy? The aristocracy and so forth. They wanted to set up a king. And so they isolated themselves, got off by themselves, and that was right at the time that Amalickiah attacked, and these people therefore would not fight, and it was necessary to go out and pacify the land. Moroni did that, and meanwhile lost the whole east coast. That was the penalty the Nephites paid for having these kingmen among them. Those that weren't killed and would not take the oath, the leaders especially, were put in prison so that they could be tried in due time, because some claimed they were innocent and didn't quite realize it, etc., etc. And in the events, in order that they could have fair trials while they were put in prison. All right, Moroni went ahead and fought the war, tried to get the various cities that had been lost. He tried to start recapturing them. He first had to stop Amalickiah from going up into the land northward, which was successfully accomplished by whom? Who headed off Amalickiah? Teancum did. Who killed Amalickiah? Teancum did in the night. And he waited for Moroni to join him so that he could start retaking these cities one at a time: Mulek, Gid, Almoner, Morianton, Lehi, and Moroni. But they were so strong that he decided to wait for Moroni. Moroni was trying to stabilize things down in the southwest sector. And Amalickiah was replaced as king of the Lamanites by whom? Ammoron, who was what relation? A brother, and of what lineage? A Zoramite. He went back, reported to the queen, recruited a whole new army, and went over and captured all of the cities of the southwest just after Moroni thought they were stabilized and had taken off to join Teancum. So Ammoron is a name you want to be sure and include in your list, Ammoron. When these 4 cities collapsed, Manti, Zeezrom, Cumeni, and Antichrists, down in the southwest, poor little Judea was the one city that was sort of holding the gap, and the captain in charge of Judea was whom? Antipas. So you'll want to put down Antipas. And then you'll recall he was, after Helaman joined him, and they tried to lure out the army from Antichrists. In the ensuing battle, Antipas was killed, and that's a good way to remember Antipas. Antichrists, they're very closely related and associated, and it was the army from Antichrists that killed Antipas, and it was then Helaman's task to take over the entire generalship of the southwest sector. Now, he was able to conquer each of the cities in due time, and I want to now go over each of the cities so you can remember not only the name of the city, but how it was captured. Yes, there was a question from the back. He was a Zoramite who didn't go with that group. There's an interesting story. I wish we knew it. In other words, there were lots of Zoramites who didn't join the wicked apostate Zoramites. But that strain, a lot of Zoramites who caused trouble for the Nephites, all down through the period here. Okay, now, what was this city? What's that city? That's the lawyer's city. Zeezrom. What's this one? They accumulated at Cumeni. And what's that one? Antipara. That one? Who's at Melech? Children of Ammon, the converted Lamanites? Ammonihah. Gideon. There's a new one for today. Gideon. You remember how Antipara was taken. First, its army was lured out by Helaman, and when they got off in the wilderness and Antipas overtook them, and Helaman came back with his 2,000 young striplings, they were able to capture or kill that main army. Then Helaman, after Antipas's death, Helaman got some supplies and help from Zarahemla, and the people of Antipara took one look, and what did they do? Departed. And so this city was taken by abandonment. That's how we remember it. Abandonment. The Nephites, the Lamanites just took off. They said, uh-oh, we're lost. Let's not stay here. Too many. Now, Cumeni was a different picture. They were not able to lure any of them out to fight. And so the only way to take them in that case was by siege. This one was taken by siege. They starved them out. Did it work eventually? Ran out of water and food, and they surrendered. And then Helaman had so many prisoners, he had to kill 2,000 of them just trying to guard them. They'd keep breaking away, and they'd have to kill them. So he killed a couple of thousand of them, and finally he said to Gid, you take them and get them down to Zarahemla out of here. We just can't stay here forever. We've got to take the rest of the cities. So Gid took off, and the Lamanites had given up just a day or two too early. The prisoners had just gotten out of sight, and a huge rescue army of Lamanites came over the hill and caught Helaman and the remaining troops at a terrible disadvantage. And a messenger went racing after Gid, caught him the next morning and said, the Lamanites have attacked Cumeni. And he said it so loud, the stupid man, that all the Lamanite prisoners heard. So what did they do? They mutinied. And Gid had to kill most of them, and those who escaped ran off into the wilderness. So Gid turned around with all his guards and his part of the army and joined Helaman just in the nick of time. And so they were able to overcome that army, and most of that army fled, actually. They took the city of Cumeni then by what? By siege. That's how it actually collapsed and allowed the Nephites to take over. All right, now what about Zeezrom? Zeezrom? No record. We assume that it was given up and abandoned. There is no record of having to fight for it. And all the Lamanites accumulated at Manti. By this time, Helaman is so weak that he just has to have supplies from Zarahemla and more manpower. He waits, he sends messages. They finally send him a few 2,000 men with a few little scraps of groceries. He is so despondent, he says to the Lord, what's happening? And the Lord says, peace, you'll be all right. You're going to succeed. Oh, then he said, we felt better. And we decided not to wait on Zarahemla, but to go ahead and attack. Now, this was a very clever device. And so he goes to Manti on the south wilderness, where he cuts them off from their source of supplies. So they've got to attack him eventually. And he lets their spies see how weak he is in his camp. And then he watches them preparing for war to come out and attack him. And as soon as he thinks it's about ripe, he puts Gid in the wilderness with a small band, Teomner, which you don't have to remember because it's only mentioned once. You might want to remember Gid, however. Teomner is put in on the other side, and then Helaman just stands waiting as a bait for the Lamanites. The Lamanites come storming out, and Helaman leads them back into their own wilderness, which they thought was great. And as soon as they had passed, Teomner and Gid closed in behind them and took the city of Manti. And what Helaman did was to take them right into the wilderness, and then he circled around gradually and headed up towards Zarahemla. And he got right about there, and all of a sudden the Lamanites are scared. Now, they don't know this country. So when they return to Manti, which route do they take? The one they came on. They don't know how to cut across. They're scared to cut across. They don't know what they'll run into. So they retrace their steps, and that gave Helaman a chance to beat them to Manti, and so he took the city. So we say he took the city by baiting or by stratagem. By baiting or by stratagem. You mean it was just a couple of days? Mm-hmm. They were chasing him, so he was able to cut across. He knew the territory well, and he cut across. So all those Lamanites then fled and went on over to Moroni. They went into this south wilderness and went on over here. All right, now everybody got that one straight? How did they recapture Zeezrom? No record, that's right. Cumeni? Siege. Antipara? Abandonment. Now you'll find, once you get this straight in your mind, it's so helpful, because otherwise all these intrigues and all this stratagem, it mixes it up in your mind. Once you get this little labeling in your mind, it'll help you so much. What part did Gid play in this? Gid and Teomner were in the wilderness on each side. So as soon as the Lamanites had gone through, they closed in, killed off the guards, you see the rear guard, and took the city. So they were holding the city while Helaman was running around. That's right. That's Gid and Teomner. Okay. All right. Now he's holding, but he doesn't know what to do. So he writes a letter to Moroni, and he says, I can't understand what's happening in Zarahemla. I'm getting no support. My men are virtually starving to death. And I'm just barely holding this territory. If I'm hit by a big army, we'll collapse. Will you please get Pehoran off the dime and make him produce? Meanwhile, here's what Moroni has done. He'd gotten up there and joined Teancum, and with his general Lehi, they had taken the city of Melech. What did they take it by? They took it by baiting. And they did it by taking Teancum and sending him down toward the seashore, where the people of Melech would think that they were cut off from Bountiful and easy to capture. Then he ran fast up the seashore and back toward Bountiful. His men fell exhausted behind the walls of Bountiful, and a brand new army came rushing out under the direction of Lehi. And so the Lamanites raced back to Melech, only to find that Moroni had gone around, occupied the city, and headed them off. The general or captain in charge of the Lamanites was named Jacob. And what happened to him in this battle? He was killed. What happened to Moroni? He was wounded. But they did take the city. And then Ammoron came along and wanted to trade prisoners, and they had a real hot exchange. And Helaman said, I don't have to trade prisoners. I know where our nephites are, and I'm not going to trade. I can take them without it. All right, so he took Gid. He next took Gid and released all the Nephite prisoners. How did he take Gid? By arming the Nephite POWs. Right? Do you remember? He had the guards approached by one of his own Lamanite soldiers, Laman. They got the guards all drunk, and when they were asleep, Moroni came and they lowered down big armfuls of bows and arrows and slings and clubs. Remember that? Spears and javelins. Was Laman? Good. Now that's a good question, because this Laman is a fascinating person. Actually, he had joined Moroni from where? He had previously been a what? Servant of the king of the Lamanites. And when Amalickiah had the king of the Lamanites killed, you remember, they tried to blame it on the king's servants. And Laman was one of those servants. And they chased him, and so he went over and joined the Nephites with a lot of his companions. All right, so how was Melech lost? By baiting or stratagem. How did they liberate Gid? By arming the POWs. What's this city called? Omner. How was it captured? No record. No record. Now, actually, these cities were up a little higher than I have them on the map. Morianton was up a little higher here. And the next city to be taken was Morianton, when all of a sudden the letter comes from Helaman. And Helaman says, will you please get Pehoran to give us some help? So Moroni sent Pehoran a letter and said, let's get some help down to Helaman right away. But immediately he got a terrible bit of news Right after he sent his first letter, some very bad news came through. What was it? One of their major cities had fallen. Nephiah had been taken. Nephiah had been taken. They've probably not been getting supplies either. So Nephiah has fallen. And Moroni was really upset now. So he really wrote a blistering letter to Pahoran. And he said, the Lord has given me a revelation. Yes.
How did the letter get to Pahoran?
The first one, you mean? Well, before the messenger apparently even got back, in other words, he dispatched the letter. Then comes the news Nephiah has fallen. So he dispatches a second letter. And those messengers get down to Zarahemla and they can't find Pahoran. So they have to go where to find him? To Gideon across the river.
What did the people in Zarahemla?
Oh, he wouldn't have had trouble probably when he got down there and found out what the situation was. See, this isn't in the book, but he probably just said, for heaven's sakes, I got to get out of here and get to Pahoran. They say he's over in Gideon. I got to get over there. So somehow he reached him. But that would be an interesting story if we had the details. Pahoran wrote back the most conciliatory letter. He says, well, I don't blame you for being angry. And Moroni had included a revelation in his letter. God had said to Moroni to do what? If the leaders in Zarahemla don't repent, you're to go down with sword in hand and pull them from their seat of power. Now, if they'd repented, of course, they would have called Pahoran back and turned over their seat of power. Who did Moroni think the Lord was talking about? Why didn't the Lord tell him it wasn't Pahoran? Who was he really talking about? Who was the Lord had in mind? What was his name? King Pachus. P-A-C-H-U-S. King Pachus. That rascal had gotten control, and he apparently did not release the other kingmen because they would be competing for the throne themselves, so he just kept them in jail. Meanwhile, he took over Zarahemla. Boy, was Moroni angry. Pahoran says to Moroni, now look, who's in charge, Moroni or Pahoran? Yeah, so Pahoran says to Moroni, his commander-in-chief, tell you what you do. I'm over here in Gideon, and I'm assembling as big an army as I can. You leave your army with Teancum and Lehi, and you recruit a new army on the way down. Now that means, as Dr. Nibley points out, we're probably talking about a vast territory with numerous cities and towns, because Moroni was able to recruit a whole new army en route to Gideon. So he comes down here to Gideon, arrives there. Pahoran has already recruited an army, and they combine and head for Zarahemla. Does Pachus resist? Yes, he did. There was a big battle. Who got killed? Pachus got killed. What happened to the kingmen that had been in prison all this time? They were tried, and if guilty, executed. Now Moroni says to Pahoran, let's go for Nephiah. So they head down toward Nephiah. They get about right here, and lo and behold, they run into what? A huge Lamanite army, which probably was coming out of Nephiah and out of Moroni to overthrow Zarahemla. See, King Pachus didn't know it. But if Moroni hadn't taken over Zarahemla, the Lamanites would have. They were going right for the capital. Once they took Nephiah, they were ready to go for the capital. And Pachus would have been killed by them if he hadn't been killed by Moroni. This is what traitors don't often realize, that in destroying the unity of a country, they lay it open for their own destruction. So they had a real good battle there. Who won? Moroni and Pahoran. They beat them. About how many killed? About 4,000. Now when the rest gave up, they had a very unusual request. They said, all right, Moroni, Pahoran, all right, you win, forget it, all right, put down the swords, don't shoot. We want to what? We want to be good Indians and be sons of Ammon. And were they allowed to do it? Yeah. And no doubt were eventually converted to the kingdom and worked hard. They went clear down to Melech and began raising corn and so forth for the soldiers. All right, now they've got to take Nephiah, which has been left with some guards. All right, now when they got to Nephiah, that city has to be taken, and Moroni arrived there with his troops. Then he got up in the middle of the night. Where did he go? one thing about the Lamanites, they did not have a good sense of security. And they would guard the gate, and they just thought those walls that Moroni had built before were just too high to scale, and they'd go to sleep with a guard at the gate. They do this over and over again and are taken. So Moroni goes way around on the west side of the city, climbs up on the wall, and what does he discover? The whole Lamanite army's over toward the east side guarding the gate. So all night long, what did he do? Used ropes and ladders and lowered a whole army inside the city of Nephiah. So when the Lamanites woke up in the morning, they got visitors. As a matter of fact, they're captured within the walls of their own city. So they open the gates and everybody tries to storm out, and obviously can't make it. So Moroni says, all right, stop them. And so finally, when these people had been subdued, what did they say they wanted to do? Yeah, we want to become sons of Ammon. We take the oath, and if you don't mind, we'd like to go down and be Ammonites. All right, Moroni said, take the oath and go down and join them. We have nothing against you. We do not want to shed your blood. You're our brethren. Just don't come to kill us, that's all. So they all went down to become Ammonites, and they began raising crops for Moroni and his army, etc. Yes? Oh, yeah, it probably is just like in America. We go over and fight communists. The communists all know that if they want to defect, we will welcome them. They do this all the time. They'll say, well, we'll take over the U.S. if we can, but if we can't, we get discouraged with our own leadership. We can always join them because they welcome us. All right. Pehoran and Moroni then said, all right, we will go for the next city that hasn't been taken. And that turned out to be Lehi. This tells us that Morianton had fallen. And who had captured it? Teancum and Lehi. All right, so there's no record. There's no record for the fall of Morianton. No record for Omner. We just know that they were taken, but no record of how. Now, when they stormed up with a massive force to take Lehi, and when the Lamanites saw this massive force, what did they do? They ran, but apparently Moroni had hedged them in, and the army apparently came in from this side. So they all departed and ran north, and ran right into the arms of whom? Lehi and Teancum. So then they reversed, did a horseshoe curve, and raced back down the beach, apparently under circumstances that allowed most of them to escape and come down here to Moroni. Now, the reason I think that Moroni did not attack the city of Moroni was, number one, he would have then had a whole pocket of Lamanites at Lehi. And it is not good political strategy to leave a pocket of the enemy behind you. Furthermore, he wanted to join forces with Teancum and Lehi. So the thing to first do was to knock out the city of Lehi, and that's what he did. And then those armies all came down to take the great fortress city, which was a pivotal fortress of Moroni. Moroni himself had built it. He'd fortified it better than any other city, and now he was ready to take it. His armies arrived exhausted. The Lamanites were exhausted. Everybody goes to bed to get a little rest by tomorrow, except one man. What's his name? Teancum. And he did exactly what he did with Amalekah. Got up in the night, used a thread so he could find his way back in the darkness because it was so complicated. I've gone down the streets of Jerusalem 2 o'clock in the morning. No lights at all. That's the spookiest experience I ever had, going down those crooked, winding streets of Jerusalem, and it is so black you just have to sort of feel along the wall. And that's the way it was. And he had a cord that would take him back to the wall until he found the house of Malachi. How was Lehi taken? Lehi was taken by, Nephiah was taken by lowering the army over the wall. Did I give you that one previously? Okay. And it was taken by abandonment. They just scared the pants off of them. They took off. Now, this time in the darkness, the javelin didn't go into Amoron quite as straight as it should have. And as a result, he was able to get up and stagger around or groan or scream or something. His servants awakened and captured Teancum and hacked him to pieces right on the spot. When it was learned by, and how they learned it, we don't know, but when Moroni and Lehi and Pehorin all learned that Teancum had been killed, they just stormed the city. So that's how Moroni was taken. It was taken by storm. They just went over the wall and went after them. Teancum could go over the wall, so could the whole army. And they just stormed the city and took it, and all the Lamanites took off for the wilderness who escaped.
Do we assume that those Lamanites that they went to
No,
began to raise crops?
they probably didn't. They would send for their families when peace was established just a few months later. That was one thing about the Lamanites. They didn't bring their families. It was Nephites who lost families. All right, now a couple of new names. Moroni now has been fighting most of his mature days. He became a commander-in-chief when he was only 25. He's been fighting ever since. He goes home to Zarahemla. He retires and is replaced by whom? We think the H-A-H on the end of a word means son of. We're not sure. But we notice that very often the son will have an H-A-H behind his name and be the same name as his father. So we think maybe that means son of. In any event, it was, if you want to know who replaced Moroni, it was Moroni-ha. Moroni's son, Moroni-ha, we pronounce it, but it was Moroni-ha. Okay? And Moroni died very shortly. He didn't last much longer after that. And amazingly, Helaman retired, became president of the church, and he also died at a very young age, remarkably young. And he turned the plates over to whom? Shiblon, who had them for just about 4 years, and all of a sudden he died unexpectedly, and they had to turn them then over to whom? Helaman's son, who is called Helaman II. Helaman II. Now there was a man who was very curious, it says, that lived at this time, and so many people were migrating up into the land northward during this period of peace and prosperity that he decided to make it easy and go by water. And so he started constructing very large, seaworthy vessels, ships. What was that man's name? Hagoth. And today's handout, which I've got to give you now, tells you the Polynesian story. And the prophets of modern times have been told that these people are descendants of some of those companies and others that were from Hagoth.